8,848 moves is the longest chess game possible. But we have to play strange moves to get here, seemingly arbitrary. Without the 50 move rule and threefold repetition, it's pretty clear the game would just be endless. But what if we limited ourselves to perfect play? What is the longest forced checkmate we can construct? From here on out, we're going to discard the 50 move rule, because without it, we can construct positions much longer. Here's a position where white can force checkmate in 549 moves. This is the longest checkmate we currently know of in finite chess. But if we expanded the board, we can go much bigger into the world of the transfinites. With an infinite board, now what's the longest forced win position we can construct? For this, not even the finite numbers will be able to hold, because we can construct positions far greater than them all. My name is Naviary. This is the search for the longest infinite chess game. To understand how we can obtain mate values beyond the finite numbers, we first need to gain some intuition for how the game tree works. The game tree shows us all possible moves and outcomes originating from a given position. With every move, we descend one step down the game tree into one of the many possible variations we could reach. If white has a winning strategy or forced checkmate, they will follow a path leading them to a win. Let's draw a tree for a finite chess position where white has mate in 3. We draw a node to represent the current position, and we'll label it 3 for the game value. If white has a winning strategy, they will always be able to make a move which decreases the game value by 1. Now it is mate in 2. If black is playing optimally, the value shouldn't change after their move. This pattern continues down to 0, which symbolizes checkmate. For simplification, I'm going to hide the white nodes, because as long as white plays perfectly, they will always reduce the clock by 1, so we won't need to worry about their branches. Now we can see, as long as both sides play perfectly, the game value should always decrease by 1 with each turn cycle. This is a very simple tree. In reality, black has many more options to choose from. Some are shorter than others. Black's optimal strategy is to pick the branch with the highest number, because it gives more time until checkmate. But as long as white can force checkmate, they will always be able to force black down a path leading to 0. But what if we don't know the value of a node we're on? How would we calculate it? We'll start by looking at all the possible moves and figuring out their values. One move here results in immediate checkmate, or value 0. Another results in checkmate after 2 moves, and that's our best move. Now, to calculate the value of our mystery node, we add 1 to the largest value below. In this case, that's 1, so the value of our node is 2. The position is mate in 2. When we look at what positions are possible on the infinite board though, a new approach is needed. Let's start at the bottom by studying a position we claim to be mate in omega, the first infinite ordinal. What's so special about a chess position that makes all finite numbers for the checkmate clock insufficient? White has the forced mate here, and it's black to move. We'll construct our tree to help us determine the game value. Remember, black's strategy is to find the branch with the highest value. If we move this rook left, by our next turn we will be in checkmate, making that branch value 0. Let's keep looking. Focusing on the middle rook, if we move up 1, checkmate will come in 2 moves. An improvement, but we can do a lot better. Move the rook up 8 squares for a checkmate in 9, or 32 squares for a checkmate in 33. And you see where this is going. There is an infinite number of moves we can make here, and there will always be another farther rook move that gives us a higher branch value. This is something new we haven't encountered yet. The numbers on these branches approach infinity. There is no one greatest number, so we can't calculate the value of our mystery node like before by adding 1 to the largest. The technically correct way of calculating a node's value is by taking the smallest ordinal greater than any value below. Omega is defined as the smallest ordinal greater than all the positive integers, which completes our tree. We have discovered a position only possible in infinite chess where the game length is essentially unbounded. The wonder of mate in omega is it allows black to say,
well, I know you're going to win, but this time it's going to take you 10 billion moves.
And then move the rook that far. White may be able to force a win, but black is the one with the power, controlling how long it will be. But why label it omega? Omega is a transfinite ordinal after all. Why are we justified in using ordinals for the checkmate clock instead of, say, mate in n or aleph null? Well, putting infinity as this position's game value would be inaccurate, because the game length is still finite. Even though in our tree there are infinite branches of increasing length, every single one of them eventually ends with a 0. Black has to pick one. No matter how far black moves the rook, white can slowly but steadily lead them to that doom of 0, the game ending after a huge but finite number of moves. While omega is a type of infinite ordinal, it doesn't actually mean the game will last an infinite number of moves. Think of it like this. Imagine an infinite line of possible states the checkmate clock could be in. The limit or order type of this line would be omega. When we say a position is mate in omega, we don't mean the game will last an infinite number of moves. Rather, we mean there's an infinite number of possible checkmate clock states ahead of it in line. But we won't touch all of them on our way to checkmate. This specific move, when black moves the rook to decide how much longer the game will last, we call an announcement. When black makes this announcement, the clock state descends from omega to a finite number, and play continues towards 0 from there. Using ordinals to represent the game value, at least we can see at any given point how many announcements black has remaining, and in that sense get a feel for how much longer the game will last or what stage we're on. Clearly, in infinite chess, we've lost the ability to accurately represent the checkmate clock with finite numbers, because the length of the game can be unbounded. Does that mean we've completed our search then? We can have a game length of any number we desire, even exceeding the time in seconds until the heat death of the universe. We just have to move the rook that many spaces away. But this is unsatisfying. We've labeled the game value of this position as omega, but omega is just one ordinal, and the ordinals can get infinitely bigger. What would a position with game value omega plus 1, omega times 2, or omega to the omega look like? Here, black received just one announcement to guarantee the game lasts another arbitrary number of moves. But what about a position where black gets 1,000 announcements to prolong the game? That definitely feels a lot bigger than our little omega. Black would have infinitely more stalling potential. More announcements gives black more flexibility for how long each segment of the game lasts, and infinitely more game-defining moments. And so, the realm of higher and higher ordinals is where we continue our search. Many of the positions I will show today are from mathematician Joel Hamkins and Professor Corey Evans' research. Their work on infinite chess is incredible. Links are in the description. We can easily reach omega plus 1 by just giving black a check before they need to make their announcement. On our tree, how do we confirm this is actually omega plus 1? We again look at all the possible moves resulting values. We can blunder mate immediately, move the rook up a little bit for a mate in 8, or infinitely other options. But giving this check results in us having an omega value position very similar to before. This time, we can see what the largest value is. It's omega, so we can simply add 1 again to get omega plus 1. We can easily increase this as well by just starting the white king farther away. Black can give as many checks as they can until they're forced to make their announcement, or get immediately mated. We can see that this new line is also approaching a limit. That limit is omega plus omega, or omega times 2. This is a position where black gets 2 separate announcements, each adding their own arbitrary number of moves to the total game length. Black to move. White's goal is to maneuver the knight to capture this pawn, checkmate following shortly after. The only piece black can move in this situation is this rook, because a movement of the knight would unprotect the checkmate square, and all other pieces are either stuck or pinned. Black can't sacrifice the rook to free himself either, because no matter where he does, he'd then be in zugzwang, forced to move the knight because it's the only piece that can move, exposing the checkmate square. So black's only option is to give stall checks for delay. White can never hide from the checks because the pinned rooks create a wall, limiting their king to the right quadrant. Black starts out by making their first announcement, which converts one of the omegas in the clock to a finite number. White advances the knight towards the checkmate square. Black then gives a huge number of checks. Once the king catches up, black makes their second announcement, the clock now dropping to a finite number, white advances closer to the checkmating square, and black gives as many checks as possible until he no longer can, at which point white swiftly mates. In total, we get a positional value of omega times 2. We can even easily extend this to give black any number of announcements we want, by just starting the white knight further away. The only points in the game when white gets to advance the knight towards the checkmate square are the moments right after black moves the rook further out, allowing us one free move before another massive wave of checks comes in. But what happens when we hit omega squared? This is the first point in our search at which we've reached a new kind of announcement. If we expand our notation, we can see now that we have an arbitrary number of announcements, which number is determined by an announcement of itself. I will call this a tier 2 announcement. Where a tier 1 announcement decides how many additional finite moves are added to the game length, a tier 2 announcement decides how many additional tier 1 announcements are made. I introduce the Rook Tower. White will win once they advance this pawn to give checkmate. To do that, they need to maneuver a few pawns and bishops. This black pawn is only here to prevent black from self-stalemating. Black starts out by moving this rook arbitrarily high, the higher the better. This is the tier 2 announcement, determining how many normal announcements we will get. The clock now drops to a number of omegas. Similar to before how white could only ever move the knight after a massive wave of checks, here white can only push a single pawn after every massive wave of checks.
I finally get to move another pawn. Well, that's good, but check. Check, 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 check. Well, gosh, I better move out of the way.
Every pawn pushed gives an additional announcement for black, and because the number of total pawns needed to be pushed is controlled by black's first move, the total value we get out of this position is omega squared. We've noticed a behavior now where the number of omegas in the checkmate clock must always decrease, never increase. No matter the number of announcements, the game length will always remain finite but massive. Black will always eventually run out of announcements, white winning shortly after. Let's step it up to omega cubed, where a tier 2 announcement allowed black to decide how many additional regular announcements they receive. An omega cubed position now gives black a tier 3 announcement, which allows them to decide how many tier 2 announcements they get. If this rook tower is equivalent to a tier 2 announcement, we need an arbitrary number of them. We need infinite. Each of these towers has what we call a lock and key. The black pawns are the locks, and these white pawns are the keys. If white can maneuver the bishops to push the key into place, it will threaten the rook, activating the tower. Black, not wanting to be captured so low, will travel up an arbitrary distance, increasing the number of pawns white has to push in this segment. After all the pawns of one rook tower have been pushed, white can make room to maneuver the next key pawn into the lock, activating the next rook tower, and the next, and so on down the line towards the king. The game begins with black firing the bishop arbitrarily far up the tunnel. This is the tier 3 announcement, deciding how many rook towers white will need to work through before they can win. The clock now drops to a number of omega squareds. White advances the pawn to break the line, allowing the bishops to be maneuvered for the first pawn key to be inserted, activating the first rook tower. Each activated tower requires black expend one of their many tier 2 announcements, which, like before, each of those determines how many regular announcements, or omegas, are added to the clock. And for every pawn white pushes, black is able to expend another regular announcement to deliver a massive wave of checks in the left quadrant, desperately trying to stop white from making progress in the towers. And white doesn't even know yet how many more pawns they will have to push to win this game. Eventually, the last rook tower is activated, the end almost in sight as white can now see just how many pawn pushes are left. And after an incredibly massive amount of moves, checkmate is finally delivered. This game is unimaginably long. Even if for every single announcement black announced a number as small as 100, the game would still end up lasting over 1 million moves. That's how much they compound. If I haven't blown your brain yet, wait till I show you omega to the 4th. An omega to the 4th game gives you a tier 4 announcement, which in turn lets you decide how many tier 3 announcements you want, which was already stupidly long itself. This is where things get insane. We can see familiar rook towers like before, but with a little more than that. The lower quadrants have been lined with bishop cannons of increasing size. And on the left, gateway terminal wings. I racked my brain figuring out how this one works, so let's break it down. We'll start in the throne room, where the kings are locked face to face. Everything in here is trapped. If white can get a bishop on this diagonal, it will be immediate checkmate. If black can get a bishop on this diagonal, it will be checkmate after 3 moves. The distinction in timing will be important. Ignoring the bishop cannons temporarily, white's goal remains the same. Make progress in the rook towers, advancing all the pawns, activating tower after tower, eventually reaching the final rook tower, releasing a bishop and circling around to deliver checkmate. The main difference here are the bishop cannons. Previously, with every pawn push white made, black was able to deliver an arbitrary amount of checks, equivalent to an omega amount of delay. But this time, for every pawn white pushes, black will be able to fire a bishop cannon, which is equivalent to an omega squared amount of delay, creating countless more threats white will have to respond to before they'll have another chance to push a pawn. Like before, the game starts off with black firing his bishop arbitrarily far up the tunnel. Except here, this represents the tier 4 announcement, and each rook tower is now a tier 3 announcement. We'll understand why that is in a moment. The clock now drops to a combination of omega cubes and lesser. White captures the bishop. Now black chooses their first cannon to fire. The bigger, the better. Choosing a cannon expends a tier 2 announcement. Black fires the first bishop out and lines it up against an opening into one of the gateway terminals. As usual, the longer the better. The fuse of the cannon has been lit, and this is white's chance to push a pawn for a very long time. Now black enters the gateway terminal, threatening to break through one of the gateway's doors. Here's what happens if white ignores it. They go on their merry way, pushing pawns to make progress. Black breaks through the door, escapes into the open, and finds his way into the king's chamber to checkmate white. How does white prevent this? Each terminal wing has a bishop guard post. When black threatens the door, the guard responds. Now, if black still tries to break through, the guard will follow closely behind and just barely beat black to checkmate. This is why it's important it takes black 3 extra moves to checkmate in the throne room. Okay, so black can't break through the door, but that doesn't mean he can't threaten to. So black threatens to break through every single door in the gateway, each threat requiring a response from the corresponding guard. On the very final door, black can go so far as to capture the door, but he can't leave that spot or the guard will beat him to checkmate again. This bishop is no longer of use. So black fires the next bishop out of the same cannon and lines it up to a new gateway terminal with 1,000 gates. Now, you might think that white has another opportunity to push a pawn here, but here's the issue. You see, the firing of that last bishop revealed a discovered pawn. If black advances that pawn, he will be able to break through the pawn barrier, releasing his armada of bishops to charge towards the kings. Because of that threat, white must reply against this bishop firing by advancing the corresponding defender pawn. When black captures now, the walls remain tight. So black has fired a second bishop out of the cannon, and white still hasn't had time to push another pawn. That bishop goes to threaten 1,000 gateway doors, until it's reached the end, and another bishop is fired, which opens another discovered pawn, forcing white to seal the wall again. This process continues for every single bishop black has in the cannon. The only bishop firing that didn't reveal a pawn was that first bishop. Eventually, the final bishop will run out of gateway doors to threat, and the cannon will be empty. Well, not completely empty, but these bishops require an extra move to get out, so black isn't interested in using those. The cannon is considered empty, and now black must choose a new cannon and fire the first bishop out. And the first bishop launched is the one that doesn't reveal a discovered pawn, which finally allows white time to push another pawn. This continues. For every single move of progress white makes in the towers, black fires a cannon of arbitrary size, and each of those bishops make an arbitrary amount of threats in the gateway terminals. The original bishop moving up was the tier 4 announcement, each rook tower is a tier 3 announcement, each pawn movement in the rook towers allows the activating of a bishop cannon tier 2 announcement, and each bishop fired from that cannon is a tier 1 announcement deciding how many gateway door threats it will make. We fast forward time to after the last rook tower has been activated, and the final few pawns are pushed. White is now close enough to checkmate where they can ignore black's threats of breaking through the doors, race to the king chamber, and win just in time. All in all, white wins this position with a game value of omega to the 4th. If I told you that omega to the 4th was the longest possible infinite chess game, I would be lying, because we can even go bigger, a lot bigger. Now, while I don't actually have an example for omega to the 5th, we do know how we can make longer positions. We know this thanks to Matthew Bolin. Let's take a look at how his proof works. We construct a position such that black is in local zugzwang. If outside of this court black ever runs out of moves, he will be forced to capture this pawn, mating himself shortly after. Because of this, black will try everything in their power to find an infinite source of moves outside of this court. Now we initiate the position. Because black doesn't want to move their king and self-mate themselves, they're forced to move this bishop, which is their only free piece. But there's no protected square to move to. No matter where it moves, white will capture, reducing black's moves to none, and checkmate happening shortly after. By itself, this position is mate in 5. Next, we add a node, still retaining this bishop as black's only other free piece. What this does is it gives black a single protected square to move to that will buy him more moves. After capture, black's goal becomes to free this bishop, because if he's able to get it into the open, white will never be able to hunt it down on an infinite board, meaning black will never be forced to move his king. To prevent this, white works to open the eyes of this bishop. All of a sudden, we find ourselves in a very similar position to before. Black has no good spot to move, because white will just capture, putting him in zugzwang again. But with this node, we have increased the length of the game from mate in 5 to mate in 23. Now what we can do is add another node, reflected, giving black an additional protected square to move to after the first node, which would increase the game length to 38. Okay, but how can we use this to construct high ordinal value positions? Let's try to recreate the most basic mate in omega position. Black's first move needs to be the announcement, and we'll need to give them infinitely many choices. If we place infinitely many nodes on this diagonal, it gives black infinitely many protected squares to choose from. For now though, moving to any one of them results in a game length of 23. We'll leave the first node untouched, but for the second one, we'll branch it to one more node, making that choice a length of 38. Then for the third node, we'll branch 2 more nodes, making sure it doesn't intersect with any of our previous diagonals, making that choice last 53 moves. The fourth node will branch 3 nodes, making that choice a length of 68, and so on infinitely. Each subsequent choice yields a longer and longer game, but it is still finite. We are in the exact same situation as we were in the original mate in omega game, where the values on our branches approach infinity. Because of this position is also mate in omega. While it understandably might be a little more complex, we can continue this method to make even longer positions. If we wanted to transform this into omega squared, what we would do is take the entire tree, rotate it and stretch it out a bit, sticking it as the first choice in this new position. Now we make the second choice have a branch length of omega times 2, the next choice length omega times 3, and so on to infinity. This would give us a total value of omega squared. In fact, doing this, there is no limit to how large a game we can construct. With infinite space to work with, we will always be able to keep stretching to fit in larger and larger announcements. Now we're cooking. But exactly how far can this take us? As we climb to higher and higher tiered announcements, it becomes clear that there's a limit to these. Omega to the omega. An announcement on a whole new level. The first announcement in an omega to the omega position would be to decide the tier of your next highest announcement. But we can go bigger. Omega to the omega to the omega. omega to the power of infinite omegas is equal to epsilon 0. The first announcement in an epsilon 0 position would be to decide how tall this tower of omegas is. But we can go bigger. Epsilon 0 to the power of omega. Epsilon 0 to the power of epsilon 0. Epsilon 0 to the power of infinite epsilon zeros gives us epsilon 1. We can repeat this to give us the next and next index of epsilon. Eventually, we reach epsilon of omega to the omega. Epsilon of epsilon 0. Epsilon of epsilon of epsilon of epsilon infinitely is equal to the Greek letter zeta 0. Zeta 0 to the power of infinite zeta zeros yields epsilon of zeta 0 plus 1. Increasing the number of epsilons above that infinitely yields zeta 1. Repeating, we can get the next and next index of zeta. Eventually, we reach the next Greek letter eta, which is also the third index in the Veblen hierarchy, phi of 3. Continuing this, we reach the limit of the Greek letters, phi of omega, but the Veblen hierarchy takes us further, phi of epsilon 0, phi of zeta 0, phi of 1. Infinitely nesting the Veblen function within itself yields the Fefferman shoot ordinal. But where there's an index, we can keep increasing. We enter the multivariable Veblen hierarchy. Increasing the variable count, we reach the Ackermann ordinal. The supremum of infinitely many variables is the small Veblen ordinal. And we can keep going, taking limits, creating new notation, and repeating what we've done before, forever. And all of these we can construct an infinite chess position out of. But there is one ordinal that is so big, no amount of repeating and taking limits will ever get us there. This ordinal is omega 1, the first uncountable ordinal. We will never construct an infinite chess position that is mate in omega 1. It is too big. It makes sense. Omega 1, by definition, is the set of all countable ordinals, which size itself is uncountable. To give black an announcement as large as omega 1 would mean to give black uncountably many choices. But at any given point, we only ever have countably many legal moves. It is infinite, but it's not uncountably infinite. That is a bigger infinity. For this reason, omega 1 is the upper bound for all things infinite chess. Maybe at its grandest scale, infinite chess is a game for the gods. These game lengths are just too long for our mere mortal selves. But that doesn't mean we can't try, or at least imagine what it would be like. We may not be able to realistically play positions with transfinite game values, but I've also never seen one come across in competitive gameplay. I have many more plans for this game, just one of them being infinite generation, so we can bring to life many of the positions from today. I'm also planning on making devlogs soon, so you guys can see some of the problem solving that goes on behind the scenes. And until I can make an in-game board editor, I actually have a spreadsheet editor you guys can use right now. It's as simple as copying and pasting. Come join the Discord server to share what you've made. I've already added a few variants designed by members of the community. A massive thank you to all my supporting patrons, with special thanks to Andreas, and a huge thanks to all the researchers involved, because without them, we wouldn't even have all this knowledge. My name is Naviary. Until next time.